All right, so we've seen how to define functions with one or more parameters, but there's still a couple of finer points around parameters we have yet to discuss. And in this video, we're going to talk about one of them, which is setting up default parameters, giving parameters a default value. So let me just illustrate what I'm referring to. Right now, we have this square function from a couple videos back, where we just, there's a single parameter num, and we return num times num. But let's suppose I want to change this up. So then rather than squaring every time, I'm going to change it to be called exponent, and it will have two parameters, a num and a power. And it's going to return num raised to the power. So as an example, if we had print exponent 2 to the third, that should return to us 2 times 2 times 2, which would give us 8. Same thing if we did, let's say, 3 to the second power, it should return to us 9, 3 times 3. And right now, it should do that. We should get 8 and 9 if we execute this. Let's verify that. Python 3, my file is called exponent.py, and we get 8 and 9. Cool. But now let's say I want a default behavior. Of the most common operation, or the most common exponential operation, is usually to square something. So let's say if I don't pass in a power, it should default to 2, so that we should square things. So this should still return 9, and this should still return 8. And let's add one more in. If I just passed in 7, it should be 49. So these will have a default value for power. And if we specify a value, it should override the default. But if we try this right now, there's a problem. And the problem is, after the first one runs, when we don't provide a power, this error is triggered. Missing one required positional argument, power. Power is required. So how do we fix this? And the answer is, we just need a little bit of magical syntax inside the function definition. Right after the parameter, we can add an equal sign and then a default value. So this right here, power equals 2, basically says, if no power is specified, by default, it should be set to 2. And now our code doesn't break anymore. Let's test it out. And now we get 8, 9, and 49. It's working. This is also the exact same idea powering things like pop. So we've seen pop before. Here's a list of countries, and I'm able to do countries.pop and specify an index like 0, in which case it takes that index and removes the item at that index. So countries is now shorter. But I can also do countries and not specify an index. And by default, the index will be the last index in the list. Oh, well, that kind of failed. I need to actually call pop. I can't just do countries parentheses. Now if we do countries.pop without specifying an index, it defaults to removing the last item. We've done the same thing here. If you don't pass in a power, it defaults to 2. Back to the slides. Here's a couple of examples. Here we have an add function with 2 default parameter values. So if you don't pass in either A or B, then we just get 10 plus 20. A defaults to 10, B defaults to 20. If you left one off, like if we passed in just 5, then A would be equal to 5 and B would be equal to 20. Or we override them both by passing in our own values. Here's another more complex example. It's called show information. And there's 2 parameters, first name and isInstructor. First name defaults to Colt, isInstructor defaults to false. And all that it does is it checks if the first name is Colt and isInstructor is true, we print welcome back instructor Colt. If first name is Colt and isInstructor is false, because that's the only other option, we return, I really thought you were an instructor. And lastly, we just return hello, whatever the first name is that's been passed in. So let's talk about why these default params are so useful. If we take an example like pop, we use it all the time. It works in 2 different, it does the same thing, but in 2 different ways, right? It will either by default remove the last item, or we pass an index and it removes that index. We use it in both situations, and there's no reason to have 2 separate functions to do that. Just have a remove last or remove by index. Instead, we put them together in pop. So in a way, it makes our code more flexible. But also, without default parameters, we often can have errors. When we try to run exponent without passing in a required power, it actually just broke. There was an error and it got mad at us. Python said, I expected exactly 2 arguments and I only got 1. What's going on? So we can avoid those sorts of errors by actually using default params. Lastly, let's talk about the values that default parameters can be. So they can actually be anything. Lists, dictionaries, strings, booleans, and what I want to highlight here, they can actually be other functions. So here's an example, and this one, if you haven't worked with another programming language before, this one might mess with your head a little bit. But if we look at what we have, first up, there's a function called add, no default values, default parameters, just it takes 2 numbers and adds them together. Same thing with subtract. We have subtract, which just takes 2 numbers and subtracts a minus b. But then we have this one called math. And math takes 2 numbers, a and b, and something called fn, which is going to be a function. And it defaults to add. And what happens here, inside of math, it just takes whatever the function is that's passed in, and it executes it with a and b. So in this first example, math 2, 2. A is 2, b is 2, and no fn was provided, so it defaults to add. So add 2, 2, which then calls add up here, which returns 2 plus 2, which is 4. So we have a default value, default parameter, which is a function, in this case add, referring to this. Or we could do math 2, 2, and then pass in subtract. And in this case, a is 2, b is 2, fn is subtract. So then it calls return subtract 2, 2, which then runs subtract, and we return 2 minus 2, which is 0. So I apologize if this confuses you more, but I just wanted to show you that the default parameter is not limited to a string or an integer. It could be a list, a dictionary, or even another function like we have here. Okay, so here I have the exact same code in a Sublime Text file, but let's, instead of putting our default parameter at the end, let's put it at the beginning. There's going to be a problem. I mean, first off, right off the bat, this function call down here is going to have function be 2, a is 2, and then b is subtract, which is going to mess everything up. But even ignoring that, here's the problem. If I just want to add 4 and 5, I know that function, or fn by default, is add, so I don't pass that in, and I just do 4 and 5, and I'm trying to do a is 4 and b is 5. It's not going to work because these parameters are assigned in order. So 4 is assigned to fn, 5 is assigned to a, and then there's nothing assigned to b. It has no default parameter, so it just throws an error. So we have to make sure that our default parameters either go at the end or that every single parameter has a default value. But we can't have one go at the beginning and then be followed by something that doesn't have a default, because then Python gets confused. It just assigns things in order, and then we end up 1 parameter short. So hopefully that made sense. I think this video is getting a little bit long, so I'm going to end it here.